Hi, I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. It's been a busy and productive summit season for the Prime Minister with some tangible results. Australian economist Sean Turnell was finally released after 650 days behind bars in Myanmar. The Prime Minister pressed the case for his freedom with regional leaders, as did the Foreign Minister in 2 direct phone calls with her counterpart in Myanmar's military regime over recent months. The more far-reaching diplomatic breakthrough, though, was Anthony Albanese sitting down with Xi Jinping. It's been 6 years since the Chinese president last held such a meeting with an Australian leader, and nearly 3 years since Beijing started imposing trade sanctions. In the end, Australia held its ground. Xi agreed to the thaw. The relationship still has its difficulties, though, but at least we're talking. This week, I was joined on the panel by Greg Sheridan, Annika Smethurst and Stan Grant. Grant, good to have you all here.
David.
Let's start with this. Greg, you wrote this weekend that Anthony Albanese's meeting with Xi Jinping was more important than even Gough Whitlam's meeting with Mao back in '73. Why?
Well, David, I think Albanese and his team have handled this brilliantly. And Gough's meeting is vastly overrated in Australian history. Australia was always going to recognise China. Maybe Gough did it a couple of months earlier than it would have otherwise been done, but it was of no material consequence. Whereas it was never absolutely clear that Australia would withstand concerted, sustained pressure of intimidation from China. It was never absolutely foregone conclusion that Labor would back the quadrilateral security dialogue which it opposed under Kevin Rudd. It was never clear that Labor would always back AUKUS, which Paul Keating opposes so strongly. It was never clear that a new and inexperienced Labor government would have such strength of character and line up the ducks with the Quad, the Japan Security Declaration, AUKUS, to demonstrate strength to China, and then for China to come back and normalise the relations without any concessions.
Well, I want to explore why this has happened, because you're right, Australia's held the line on all of those things, and clearly the agreement to have a meeting didn't happen overnight. Penny Wong, as Foreign Minister, really broke the ice in July, meeting her counterpart Wang Yi. They had a follow-up meeting in September. I understand she spoke to him again about a week ago, giving an assurance that if the leaders met, Albanese wouldn't be embarrassing Xi Jinping. He'd conduct himself the way she had after their meetings. So a lot of effort on the Australian side, Stan. What about on China's side? Why did Xi Jinping decide to re-engage now?
Xi Jinping has had the meetings that he's had and given up nothing. There is no concession from Xi Jinping. There's no concession on trade. He's made no concession about releasing the Australians detained there, like the journalist Chang Lei. Nothing about the Uyghurs. He is now installed as president for life after getting that third term. He's surrounded himself with his own acolytes. He still says that he reserves the right to take Taiwan by force, and the clock is ticking on that. So from Xi Jinping's point, he says, well, here I am. I am the leader of a great power. His argument has always been that as a great power in the world, and remember it's the biggest engine of economic growth by some margin globally, that they have a place in the world order. And now he is on that stage having these meetings. I think what's critical here, I take Greg's point about being a more important meeting than the Gough Whitlam meeting, because Xi Jinping is a much more powerful leader, because China is a much more powerful country than it was back in the 70s. But one of the reasons, and perhaps the biggest reason we're talking now, is that America's talking. Biden and Xi had a 3-hour telephone conversation. The thaw in relations have followed that. Biden and Xi had the lengthy meeting that they had at G20. And if you look at the arc of the downturn in our relationship, from 2017, when America declares China a strategic competitor, you start to see things freeze. And now, as America and China are talking, there's a whole lot of factors playing into that. We're starting to see a bit of a window of an opportunity for a reset.
And the factors playing into that, Annika, include what's going on in China's economy too, right? I mean, they're having a tough time. Their economy's weakening. Some of these trade sanctions and so on haven't necessarily turned out the way they might have hoped.
Weakening, but Stan is right to say, you know, they are still the powerhouse when you look at their growth compared to the US. But I think that's right. Domestically, and you wrote about this week, neither side have taken a hit. You know, they've both managed to go to this meeting, even though it was China that has obviously given in here. We've always wanted to have these lines of communication. But they have to, there's two things at play. There's a domestic political reality and there's also a foreign reality. And I think you're right about that. We've managed to weather these years, the trade sanctions and not having those lines of communication in a way that perhaps they didn't think we would. It wasn't great, but we've managed to get through it. So there really was nowhere else for them to go. And whilst none of this is over, whether it be Huawei or any of the issues with the handling of the COVID inquiry, it doesn't just go away, but just by having this meeting, it's an incredible step forward.
Greg, you said the Albanese government's handling of this has been brilliant, this relationship, not giving ground on any of those things, but dialling down some of the rhetoric, and clearly the government's making a point of that. How significant, how important has that been?
Well, look, I think actually I'd answer that by emphasising Stan's point. Australian relations with China are often a function of American relations with China. Now, I think the Albanese government has handled this very, very professionally, but the dynamic for this meeting is to be found in Beijing, not in Canberra. It wasn't Australian statecraft. I mean, it's important that they don't talk about war the way Morrison and Dutton did and so on, but the problem was not caused by Morrison and Dutton. And China punishes a country typically for a certain period of time, and then it says, OK, punishment's over, we're going to try something else. So punishment hasn't worked, it's now going to try something else on us. It's got a lot of enemies all at once. It's made its own calculations in Beijing. The role of Australian statecraft, although I'm full of praise for Albanese and his government, I think was probably quite small in this.
We might be out of the doghouse. I'm not sure about Canada, though. There was this moment on the sidelines of the G20 meeting.
Everything we discuss is then leaked to the paper. That's not appropriate. And that's not how the way the conversation was conducted. If there is sincerity on your part,
free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have.
I made sure the cameras were there
Boy,
to capture
he
what does
look
that tell
chastened?
us?
Did he look chastened, didn't he? I mean, it says that Xi Jinping walks through the world with the confidence of being, in some measures, the most powerful person in the world. That's what he's being called.
When you look at the G20, right, all the coverage, not just here but around the world, was about who's meeting Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and remember, David, and I'm all for conversation with China. I think you can't ignore the fact, and we don't live in the world as we would like it, we live in the world as it is, and a big power that is the biggest engine of economic growth, that is on track to become the biggest economy in the world, cannot be ignored. So but he's the same Xi Jinping who is accused of orchestrating a genocide. The same Xi Jinping that has cracked down in Hong Kong on democracy protesters. The same Xi Jinping who has locked up rivals. The same Xi Jinping before G20 was wearing military fatigues and warning of war with Taiwan. This is the Xi Jinping we deal with. He is confident in that. This is something that I continually, and having lived there for a long time and seen this from the inside, the world is at a tipping point, and I think we're going to be in danger of missing the wood for the trees here. Yes, the meetings are important, but there is a big power in the world that we have assisted to become a big power in the world that rejects the global compact, and that reckoning is still coming, and he is increasingly confident in his place in world.
Well, that's a very good point and brings us to how we handle things from here, right? Because as I mentioned, this is not going to be necessarily smooth sailing from here on in. Annika, all of those problems still remain. Taiwan is still a huge difference between China's position and that of the West. What should we take from the last few years, this experience of being in the deep freeze, about where we go to now?
Well, I think Albanese made it pretty clear in his statement from the G20 that he's not going to compromise any of Australia's values, any of our national security interests, just because we've started this conversation again. And I can't see him straying from that. You know, if these conflicts do come up, just because we've started this, line of dialogue and potentially some trade again and things like this, he can't. He's elected to be Australia's Prime Minister, so our interests come first. to think that just because they've had this meeting that all of a sudden these issues are going to go away is naive. It's not. But as Stan says, there is a reality. They are a power. They're in our region. What they do impacts us more than, many other countries. So, he really had no choice. And that's not to take away from the achievement that this has been.
Yeah, but a lot of questions about when are we going to see the trade sanctions lifted, and when are we going to... someone said to me, Xi Jinping meeting with him is a bit like meeting with the emperor. He doesn't get into the specifics. He basically signals whether he's pleased or displeased with where things are at. In fact, Anthony
Justin Trudeau found out.
That's right. As Anthony Albanese, he kind of made a similar point, really.
It is not that sort of process. This isn't a discussion at a commercial level. What it is, the system doesn't work that way.
Yeah, the system doesn't work that way, Greg, but there will be an expectation that we gradually will see some of these sanctions lifted.
Well, the danger here is exaggerated expectations, which the government has been trying to tamp down. So he's invited Jacinda Ardern to go to China, just like he invited Manasseh Sogavare. So if you're a complete, absolute servile lapdog, you'll get an invitation.
Are you suggesting Jacinda Ardern is?
Well, perhaps that's an unfortunate metaphor, but I think she's excessively governed by what she thinks Beijing will react to. So the point I want to make, though, David, is that we should not handicap ourselves by allowing Beijing to define what is a success. All of Beijing's strategic objectives, which contradict with us, getting rid of the Americans, dominating the South China Sea, crushing human rights within China, supporting dictatorships, cyber attacks, all the rest of it, they're absolutely unchanged. And the Chinese would love it if the debate within Australia is, OK, Albo, why didn't you get the trade sanctions lifted? Why didn't you get an invitation? That sort of thing. We can't let them define the success of our diplomacy. We are reasonable and willing to have dialogue, and if they don't want to... And actually, our trade hasn't suffered much. We've had $20 billion of sanctions, but our exports to China are still as big as the US, Japan,
I think they actually increased over
a lot of the producers affected by this did, and perhaps this forced them to found other markets.
And it's critically important that we diversify. I mean, one of the biggest things we could have done to diversify was develop Indian investment in our resources, and we subjected the poor old Adani mine to 10 years of water torture. So the Chinese, in a sense, pushed us into good policy over the last few years by showing us what their real strategic objectives are. We mustn't go back to thinking they're just a cuddly panda that we can, they'll tickle our tummy and everything will be sweet now.
All right, I'll now time to talk to the Shadow Foreign Minister and Liberal Senate Leader Simon Birmingham. To take us there, here was President Xi Jinping speaking to Anthony Albanese at the start of their talks.
Because China and Australia are both important countries in the Asia-Pacific region, we should improve, maintain and develop the relationship between the two countries. It is in line with the fundamental interests of the two countries and is also conducive to promoting the development of peace in the Asia-Pacific region and the world. Since Mr. Prime Minister took office, you have made a number of remarks on China-Australia relations on a number of occasions and have repeatedly said that you will deal with China-Australia relations in a mature manner. I attach great importance to your opinion.
Simon Birmingham, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David. Good to be with you.
So the diplomatic freeze with China is now over. We heard Xi Jinping there citing the mature approach of the Albanese government. Is that how you see it?
Well, David, I welcome very much the fact that this meeting has occurred, and I welcome it on a couple of scores. Importantly, the previous governments under Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison had to make many necessary but difficult decisions on foreign investment, on protection of critical infrastructure, in safeguarding our democracy, in handling sensitive telecommunications decisions such as the role of Huawei. These were difficult decisions and they were always going to cause difficulty in relation to our relationship and engagement with China. But the conduct of these meetings demonstrates that China's attempts in terms of diplomatic isolation of Australia, the attempted economic coercion through the unfair trade sanctions, have not been yielded to. They have not seen any change in Australian policy, and I welcome the fact that the Labor government has maintained those policy settings of the coalition and has maintained a recognition that the strategic challenges of the environment we're in have not changed.
But does it also help that the Prime Minister's not talking about the need to prepare for war, that it's inevitable we'd join a conflict over Taiwan, not constantly comparing this situation to the 1930s?
Well, David, it's important that we maintain a consistency in policy and a consistency where possible in language as well, but that language has to be one that reflects the reality of the challenging circumstances we face.
But does it help that the rhetoric's dialed down, is my question?
Well, this government will have difficult times to come, no doubt. There is an inevitability that the challenges the previous government faced will be repeated at different junctures in the future. It's still early days for the Labor government. We'll see how they handle those challenges when issues in relation to the South China Sea come up.
But does it help that the war talks dialed down?
Well, David, I think it's important that we maintain a position in terms of our language and our approach to the region that seeks to be as engaging as possible with all partners in the region, as respectful as possible, but also firm in terms of Australia's national interest, and when necessary, calling out egregious breaches by others, be that in relation to activities such as in the South China Sea or human rights matters. And I note that in that regard, since the election of the Albanese government, we've had the UN report on the Xinjiang region released. They joined in the condemnation with other nations, but they haven't joined in action like other nations in terms of the use of Magnitsky-style sanctions. And as a coalition, we would offer bipartisan support for them to do that.
Just on that, so that's interesting. You want the government to impose Magnitsky-style sanctions on officials in China?
Following the release of that UN report back in September, I wrote to Penny Wong offering bipartisan support in that regard. She had previously criticised the previous government for not acting in concert with other nations. And so I wanted to make sure that, given those new sanctions laws were passed late in the term of the previous government, that we would give that bipartisan support if the new government chose to use those sanctions.
All right, I'll come to some other sanctions questions in a moment elsewhere, but that's interesting. Let me just ask you about Taiwan. Do you think Australia should be supporting Taiwan's entry to the CPTPP trade pact?
I think we should judge it on its merits. Anthony Albanese's answer that he gave to a question the other day was clearly wrong and erroneous. He sought to say that it wasn't wrong, but his claim that Taiwan could not join because it is not a nation was wrong.
Well, he didn't say they could not join. He just noted the fact that they are not recognised as a nation.
Well, he seemed to use that as a justification for why they couldn't join or shouldn't be allowed to join, David. The reality is that Taiwan is a fully fledged member of the World Trade Organisation. So too is Hong Kong, with whom Australia has a free trade agreement. So any consideration of Taiwan joining the CPTPP should be on the basis of assessing how we maintain unity amongst the members of the TPP, but crucially whether Taiwan can live up to the high ambitions of the TPP, the merits of the argument there. It is an ambitious trade agreement. It has particular terms in relation to, for example, state-owned enterprises and how they operate, as well as the management of data flows, transfer and storage. These set a very high standard for a trade agreement, and they ought to be judged on that, and working cooperatively with all members of the TPP as to whether, if they can meet those standards, then they can join.
Should Taiwan be recognised as a nation-state?
No, David, there's no change in relation to the bipartisanship of Australia's position there, recognising China's position in relation to one China, but not expecting and wishing to see any change to the status quo undertaken in any unilateral way.
What about the position on strategic ambiguity, what we might do in the event of any conflict over Taiwan? What's your view on that?
Well, David, my view is that we should assess all of these matters carefully as things unfold and develop, but we should be prepared for any eventuality. And so we'll be looking carefully and closely at the Defence Strategic Review when it is released early next year, how that can help to enhance Australia's preparedness for any and all eventualities in terms of the protection of our nation and the security of our region. During
the 9 years of the coalition government, there was no minister visited Taiwan. Your colleague, the Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, when he was on this program, said he'd consider visiting. Would you?
Well, I did visit many years ago now, and there
Not
were...
as a minister, though.
not as a minister. There were some discussions around a possible visit just prior to COVID occurring. Obviously, COVID put paid to all visits, as it did to meetings such as the summits we've seen occurring face-to-face for the last couple of years. But I would certainly be open to seeing a minister visit, and that will be a matter for the now government to consider.
So even though you guys didn't do it, you would like to see a Labor minister visit?
Look, I would be open to seeing that occur. Obviously, it's got to occur in the right and constructive way as to who goes and when they go.
The Australian economist Sean Turnell is back home after 650 days behind bars in Myanmar. Was the Foreign Minister Penny Wong right, do you think, to directly engage with the military regime there to secure his release?
It's been right to see a consistency of effort in relation to Professor Turnell, who we warmly welcome and are very relieved to see him back in Australia, but a consistency of effort right throughout both the previous government and this government. Marise Payne and Penny Wong both worked hard with regional counterparts and others.
Penny Wong directly engaged the regime. Marise Payne, as far as I'm aware, did not. Do you think it was the right call?
Well, as long as Australia's position in relation to the other human rights abuses, the thousands of individuals who are still detained in Myanmar remains consistent, as long as those views continue to be put very, very strongly, and as long as we look for how we can enhance pressure on the Myanmar regime to better respect human rights and to see a return to genuine democracy, not sham elections as many fear will occur next year. These are important considerations, and the government has to be consistent in all of its engagement there.
Should Australia now impose sanctions on Myanmar?
Well, Australia should be looking for how we work with regional partners to increase pressure on Myanmar, and sanctions should be on the table as part of that.
So the Morrison government didn't impose sanctions on Myanmar. Why not?
Again, David, part of that consideration should be the fact that we've seen late in the piece of the previous government the passage of those new Magnitsky-style sanctions laws that do give further options to government as to how they target and how they direct sanctions, but also the timing in terms of an opportunity to work with regional partners, where we've seen that, sadly, Myanmar having signed on to ASEAN's 5-point plan, which we put great store in previously, but that has not seen any progress, and so there need to be alternative actions pursued as a result of the failure.
Okay, but you guys didn't do it in government, but again, you're saying Labor should at least consider it.
Well, times have moved on there, David. As I said, in government, we were lending great support to working with the other ASEAN nations. Their 5-point plan was an important attempt of the region to try to get progress in Myanmar. Sadly, Myanmar thumbed its nose not only at people in its own country, at the rest of the world, but also at its ASEAN partners. And so new further efforts are necessary given the failure of that process.
Even though they've just done what we've asked for and released Sean Turnell, you think we should be slapping sanctions on them because of the human rights abuses that are going on there?
We cannot turn a blind eye to the thousands of other individuals who are detained in Myanmar, to the abuses occurring across the country, to the oppression of minorities that are happening, to the suppression of democracy, and to the fact that it would appear they are preparing to undertake a sham election next year as an entree to try to get themselves back into the international acceptance. Well, international acceptance should not occur off the back of a sham election, should not occur when we see such extensive human rights abuses occurring.
What about Iran? The coalition is also calling on the government to impose sanctions on Iran over its treatment of women. What sort of sanctions?
Well, targeted sanctions on the leadership of Iran, of the Revolutionary Guard. These are the types of measures that many other nations have applied. Australia is a long way behind like-minded countries and comparable nations when it comes to action in relation to Iran. Since the murder of Mahsa Amini, we've seen many other lives lost, but we've also seen enormous courage from Iranian civilians coming out onto the streets in their thousands, making clear that they are standing firm in support of the rights, particularly of women and girls. And there is a sense that this could be a moment of time in relation to Iran. We won't know that for sure until things unfold, but Australia should be leaning in to support those brave souls in Iran,
so to stand clear on
consistent with other nations.
Are you saying that Magnitsky-style approach for senior figures in Iran, or are you saying we should go a whole lot further and stop selling wheat and wool and meat to Iran?
Many of the Iranian Australians that I've engaged with have asked not for, and they've expressly said they don't want sanctions that could hurt the Iranian people in terms of those economic sanctions.
Right.
But they do believe that there are many cases for targeted individual sanctions to be applied, as we've done in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and both the previous coalition government and the Labor government have put in place further sanctions there. It's only fit and proper that we should act in terms of support for the movement that's occurring in Iran. That looks like it could, as I say, be a moment in time, and therefore Australia shouldn't be way behind like-minded countries. We should be working and acting in concert with them.
Let me turn to some domestic issues, the resumption of Parliament tomorrow and your role as the opposition leader in the Senate. Just a few things. Will you support the bill to establish a National Anti-Corruption Commission?
We're waiting for the parliamentary committee processes to conclude and to see precisely what type of amendments come through those. I hope and trust that they will have considered the evidence from the Law Council of Australia, the Bar Association here in my home state of South Australia, and others that have argued around ways in which the Anti-Corruption Commission can be improved in terms of the model presented, and that with those types of amendments that hopefully we can offer bipartisan support for its passage. The
industrial relations reforms you're not supporting. If not, what do you think should be done to get wages moving, or are you satisfied with where wages are at?
David, the importance of getting wages moving is one that we share, but this is not a bill that will get wages moving. It's a bill that will get unemployment moving. It's a bill also that is not consistent with the policies the Labor Party took to the last election. So we have a Labor government that didn't tell Australians in advance of these policies, certainly didn't tell Australian small businesses, the tens if not hundreds of thousands of small businesses who will be adversely affected by these policies, that they were going to bring them in, and are now seeking to rush them through the Parliament. We've been very clear all along that you have to maintain economic strength to get wages moving.
What does that mean?
This is an economy growing as strongly as possible, keeping unemployment as low as possible. Those are the things that our government managed to achieve with strong economic growth in our last year in office, with unemployment down to 50-year lows, creating the conditions for economic growth to help to drive productive wages growth.
That was the problem, though. You guys didn't achieve much wage growth.
Well, this, unfortunately, from the Labor Party is a bill that is going to only put pressure on businesses, only create an environment for more strike action, for lower productivity and for job losses. They're not things that are going to provide for sustainable wages growth into the future, even if it essentially is legislation that pushes wages in some sectors. It's also going to push unemployment up in many sectors.
On energy prices, can you just clarify, are you opposed to any higher taxes on the windfall profits of gas companies?
David, we don't think that simply slugging a tax in relation to companies is going to do anything for the energy prices of Australians. You've got to fix supply in the gas market to provide for genuine outcomes there, and those types of taxes will actually only hurt you in the longer term, because they'll act as an investment disincentive and mean you've got less supply for the future.
But if it's a tax on the windfall profit, that revenue could then be used to do something about the prices, presumably.
And if you go down that sort of path, as I said, you will also create a disincentive for investment, which means you'll only exacerbate and continue the supply problem into the future. So it would be a counterproductive measure in terms of tackling
so just
the
let them pocket the windfall.
There.
Let them pocket the windfall profits from these resources.
David, let the government come up with a policy that's actually going to work.
You just said you're opposed to any tax, right?
So, David, I've been clear that I think it would be a counterproductive measure because it would actually hurt supply in the future. So this government had 5-6 months leading up to their budget. They didn't do anything in the budget. They've now had close to a month since the budget. They haven't managed to come up with a policy since the budget either. There's clearly enormous internal division in the government, as some, and many it seems, would agree with the type of proposition I've put, that some of these floated measures around taxes or price caps or the like will only act as a disincentive to investment, and in doing so mean you prolong supply challenges. The government should reverse some of their budget decisions that actually will make it harder to bring more supply into the marketplace. and they should be working more constructively with industry rather than the type of excessive rhetoric we've seen from some ministers that seems to suggest they want to be at war with industry.
Just finally, on the voice to Parliament, you're the leading moderate in the Liberal Party now. Do you support an Indigenous voice being enshrined in the Constitution?
David, I strongly support recognition and have done for many years, and of course the debate around the voice has come along subsequent to early efforts to try to achieve Indigenous recognition. When it comes to the model for the voice, I do think Australians deserve to see more detail and have more answers about how it will work, how it will be constituted, and how it will make a difference. I understand the very passionate views by those who argue for the voice, and I don't wish to see them disrespected in any way, but I also acknowledge that there are strong Indigenous views of doubt and question about whether the voice will be actually effective in achieving any substantial change on the ground in relation to
you seriously haven't made up your mind after all the debate on this?
David, we're going to be asked to support a constitutional change for a model that is as yet undefined by the government in relation to that model. It's not unreasonable to want to see the detail of the model.
All right. Simon Birmingham, thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Let's get back to our panel, and we're joined once again by Greg Sheridan, Annika Smethurst and Stan Grant. I just want to pick up on a couple of things, in particular sanctions. We heard there from the Shadow Foreign Minister, a call for a few things, Greg, as it turns out. Consider sanctions on Myanmar, China, with Magnitsky-style sanctions, Iran as well. Is this going to put a bit of pressure on the government, do you think?
Look, I think Burma is a good foreign affairs spokesman for the opposition. He doesn't make mistakes on top of his brief. I think it would be a tremendous mistake to levy sanctions on Myanmar. And if you do, what you're telling all future governments is, if you have an Australian hostage, don't release them. Or if you've got several hostages, only release one and keep the others as leverage. The other thing is, we live in Southeast Asia. The majority of ASEAN nations are not democracies. They don't share our values. They have a different view of the nature of humanity and the nature of the world. And we need to live and breathe and work and be familiar with this region. You're better off, the whole world condemns Myanmar, and so do we, for what it's done. But you're better off to have some engagement. We wouldn't have got Sean Turnell. Sanctions on Iran, fair enough. Sanctions on China, I think that's pretty dubious. The Magnitsky sanctions are essentially symbolic. They allow you to feel good about yourself. But I'm pretty impatient with performative symbolism as the substance of politics.
We should just explain to those who may not know what the Magnitsky refers to, Stan. We're talking about individuals.
Targeting individuals, targeting their businesses. It's not sanctions against the country as such. And
but it means if they want to take a holiday somewhere else?
Yeah, it emerged out of Russia, of course, you know, and targeting sanctions against Russia. I think Greg's right about sanctions against Myanmar. I don't think ASEAN nations want them. ASEAN nations were critical in the negotiations and getting Sean Turnell out, particularly countries like Indonesia. I think Greg makes a very interesting point as well about living with countries as they are. You know, not all countries are of the West, in the West, or have to be the West, and I think that applies also to China. What does a global order look like when there are significant countries? And bear in mind, by 2050, I think there may be only one or maybe two Western countries in the top 10 economies in the world. When this is in flux, when these things are changing, what does a global order look like? And it makes us reassess all things, including how we approach questions of human rights. What is our business and what is not? Iran, though, every week, David, we are inundated on Q&A with questions about Iran. Iranian people standing up. We had one woman stand up a couple of weeks ago and said, if I wear what I'm wearing tonight in Tehran, I could be killed.
It's appalling.
We are seeing women leading these protests, women being killed in Iran. Countries have let Iranian protesters down in the past. They've been encouraged to come out in the streets. We've deserted them, and we've seen the regime crack down again. And they're calling for action. Not just sanctions, but what about permanent residency in Australia? We have people in Australia, Iranians, on 10-year-old temporary protection visas. They're not going back. They don't have Medicare cards. They live in limbo. Their children are in limbo. There are things the government can do, and the Iranian community is criticising them for not doing enough.
On Sean Turnell, it was terrific to see him released, and you know those pictures that we saw of him getting back home with his partner, and you can see just physically the toll that this has clearly taken. 650 days behind bars there. But this did involve a fair bit of work behind the scenes, although, Annika, it was part of a mass amnesty on the day.
6,000.
Yeah, nearly 6,000 people were released. I think there's a few national days where they do release prisoners, and there's one that passed. They were hoping it would happen, it didn't. Then this national day where he was released. I mean, it's a success for the efforts to get him out. Huge relief, though. It
is a success and a relief. I don't think we can take away from that, but I do sort of agree with Greg here. This was part of, you know, an Asian solution here. It wasn't just us. Yes, we did have lines of communication open, and that's important. It was a slow process, as often these diplomatic sort of negotiations are. But I think it has to be treated differently. He was one of 6,000 people released, different from when we look at people we've had locked up in other countries like Iran, notably recently. So I think the sanctions issue, we've got to take that into consideration when you look at it. It was a very different situation from, say, what's going on in Iran or other issues we've had with prisoners. Well, let's turn to Russia, a couple of fronts. One, we saw this week the guilty verdict handed down in a Dutch court to the 3 men responsible for shooting down MH17 back in 2014. 298 people killed, 38 Australians. And I think Penny Wong really reflected the emotion that many have felt around this.
That these people could decide to down a civilian aircraft.
Sorry.
Hang on, just takes. With children on it, it's beyond words.
It certainly is, but is there much prospect of these 3 individuals ever spending a day behind bars, Greg?
No, there's almost no prospect, I would think. They have their travel restricted as a result of this, and this is a good process. It's good that it's gone on. The bottom line is China won't desert Russia fundamentally. It'll put some pressure on at the margins, and it'll let that G20 statement go forward. That's great. But Russia survives because it sells a lot of stuff to China, Vietnam and India and so on. Now that, even if we hate that, in a sense that also puts a constraint on Russian behaviour because it gives them something they don't want to lose. So you saw Xi Jinping, and I absolutely agree with Stan's characterisation of Xi Jinping. You saw him say, don't use nuclear weapons. So there is some constraint which even the Chinese, Vietnamese and Indian engagement with Russia has on their behaviour. Nothing more will come out of this this conviction than symbolism, but it's a good move.
And the pressure we saw at the G20 was building on Russia as well over the war in Ukraine. Now, they managed to come up with a final declaration which did note that, it condemned Russia's aggression but noted there were other views on the situation. However, the host of the G20, Joko Widodo, made it very clear what his view is.
Stop the war. I repeat, stop the war.
Yeah, stop the war. He deserves some credit, Stan, doesn't he, for getting the group to that point?
He does. I think also it reminds us with the MH17 verdict that this is a war that is not just a year old.
No.
I mean, you're talking about 2014. I think also, to Greg's point, China is, Xi Jinping said nothing in his address at the Congress when he's, assumes his 3rd term about Russia. But he is not backing away from Russia either. When he talks about Putin as his best friend, as this no-limits pact, he's got an eye as well on how this may serve him. There may be lessons in it for him in terms of what would happen if he tried a premature or a hasty invasion of Taiwan. But if you look at China, they're looking at the West, at the United States. It's been bogged down in 20 years of unending conflict in Afghanistan, in Iraq, that is now pumping treasure and weapons into Ukraine, is engaged again in a conflict. China has not had to fight any of these. In that 20 years, it's seen its economy grow. It's focused internally on its own issues. It's built its own military power, preparing for a war on its terms in this region that a lot of military analysts say they could win. A strategically limited war in this region. So there are things that Xi Jinping is looking at here and working that into how he sees these things play out in the world. I don't see how this war in Russia ends. I don't see how it ends in the short term. It is something, again, that the West struggles to understand, I think, is that wars of identity, wars that are in your bones. I think that's what Xi Jinping talks about when he talks about Taiwan, the humiliation narrative, the wars of Islamist militancy, the war that Russia is undertaking in Ukraine. These things are not easily negotiated away. And the fear is, of course, how does he end it?
It's a rather depressing forecast. But on that note, let me turn to the election campaign in Victoria, Annika, because you're up to your neck in this at the moment. 6 days to go. What is this election about?
It's hard to know. It's one of the nasty streaks we've seen come out during it. It's quite a bitter campaign, which is interesting because there's not a lot of big policy areas. There is the, $2 public transport and SEC, and there's sort of these things around the area. But in terms of I guess a big vision, it's sort of lacking that. Now, I don't know if it's because we've had a federal election this year or because we had the federal budget a bit later, but it seemed to take a while to, I guess, gain momentum, this election.
A lot of disengagement, right?
A lot of disengagement. That's what people are saying, although there has been a lot of early voting, but I don't think that's I think that's a level of we just want to get it done.
Get it done and get it over with.
It took a while to get that sort of momentum. I think it's been really brutal. There's been a lot of personal politics.
I want to come to that. But
I think
is this in large part about Dan Andrews? Is it a referendum on Dan Andrews?
That's what the Liberal Party are trying to make it about, and I think there is some element of that. I spoke to some Labor people on polling booths this week. Polling's been open for a week now. Huge numbers have been out. And they're saying, they're feeling a little bit rattled. They're saying, look, there is an element which they saw with, I guess, Bill Shorten, when people said, I want to vote Labor, but I'm not 100% sold on Bill Shorten, and it ultimately cost them the election. Now, I don't think it's at that level. Labor have a huge majority here that they'd have to have a pretty disastrous result to lose. But it does seem to be working. I think even people that are pro-Labor and do want to support Labor might not be, I guess... we do have this thing in Australia where we just get sick of seeing people, and in some ways the Daily Dan press conferences, I think people want politicians out of their lives a little bit, and he did become one of the most recognisable faces and polarising. Some people were very pro his approach, but a lot of people weren't.
Look, the issue in the last few days, integrity's been an issue throughout this campaign in Victoria. In the last few days, there's been a development that, well, it's something we don't often see in Australian politics. The Victorian Electoral Commission referred the Liberals leader, Matthew Guy, and his former Chief of Staff to the Integrity Commission, IBAC, over some matters about what the former Chief of Staff had been trying to do. The Liberals then complained that the Electoral Commission, the Independent Electoral Commission, was interfering in the campaign. Now, Greg, as I say, you don't often see a major party accuse the Electoral Commission of interfering. What did you make of this?
Well, I think there's merit in the Liberals' complaints about the Electoral Commission. I mean, they ought to just shut up during an election and they can prosecute this afterwards. Is there an argument, though, that if they'd shut up, they're also being political by not doing what they should be doing? I suppose there's an argument, but I think it's better for them to be seen to be not interfering. I think this is a very depressing campaign. Andrews deserves to lose. Guy certainly doesn't deserve to win. I think two very quick points I'd make to you. One is, I don't think state politics now has the resonance in people's lives, and that's sort of bad for democracy because, I'm a political journalist, I live in Melbourne, I could barely tell you another opposition frontbencher other than Matthew Guy. And, my adult sons would barely register that the Victorian government exists. I shouldn't defame my sons like that. The other point is that the Victorian government now has a debt which any profligate third world country would be proud of, a state debt bigger than New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania combined. And yet the health system is in crisis. And
neither side's talking much about what they're going to do about that debt.
No, and in fact all of their economic propositions are crazy on both sides of government. I think for the first time in my life I'm tempted to scrawl on the ballot paper, none of the above.
Don't advocate informal votes on the program.
I'm tempted.
Look, while I've got you here, I've got to ask you too, just finally, about Donald Trump, because this was, quite a moment. He promised before the midterm elections that he'd have a big announcement to make. Midterms happened, didn't work out quite as well as he might have hoped. All of his hand-picked candidates, most of them anyway, bombed. But he still had to go ahead with the big announcement. Here it was.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
Stan, it kind of felt like it fell flat. He was just sort of going through the motions there. It didn't really set fire to anything. What's going on?
Yeah, but, you know, I still wouldn't count Trump out, either winning the nomination or even winning the presidency. For this reason, I think that we can focus on Trump, we can focus on Biden, but whether it's Trump or Biden, the problems in America are so deep-rooted. Inequality that is a cancer, life expectancy that is going backwards, an opioid epidemic, a gun violence epidemic, the racial and class divisions, this roiling anger and sense of disenchantment that sits at the heart of America. We talk about the international order and how that is being reset. But so is the American compact, the idea of the dedication to the proposition that Abraham Lincoln talked about. All of these things are up for grabs, and that's where a character like Trump is able to come in and speak to, not to unite, but to divide, not to American dream, but to American carnage. And there's still enough of that there for that to bite, and still enough of that there for Trump to exploit.
Yeah, just quickly, is Trump done, or are you also...
Well, look, I hope so, but I mean, on a previous incarnation on one of your programs, I said Trump was done, so I wouldn't bet on my forecast. I hope he's done. I think Stan's right, though. The underlying issues are there, but hopefully a more civilised person like Ron DeSantis can carry forward those populist
with real answers.
With real answers. Right. Hopefully Trump is done. Mind you, he's good for newspapers.
All right. Our panel, Greg Sheridan, Annika Smethurst and Stan Grant, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. We've come to the National Cartoon Gallery here in Coffs Harbour, where the president of the Australian Cartooning Association, the one and only Cathy Wilcox, is leading the charge with the Australian Cartoonists Association annual conference.
That's right, our annual conference and Stanley Awards Gala night.
Yep.
And therefore I have not been producing any cartoons this week because I have been flat out folding napkins into the shape of big bananas.
Things have been a little bit frosty as far as Australia's relationship with China, but we may be thawing a little.
Yeah, I don't know which scenario makes me more uncomfortable, actually.
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, had a meeting and it was good to see you.
Very nice, very nice. Yes, that's right. A warm, firm hand grip. I don't know if there's any, like little pop gun or
little buzzer.
Yeah, thing going in there. Or
he's certainly been meeting a lot of dignitaries, Joko Widodo and Emmanuel Macron. It's a very different scenario to where we were just a few short months
back.
I
don't think I know.
I don't think I know that's true. Lovely David Pope. He's got the president will see you now as in the freezer is Anthony Albanese.
Warming his hands by the fire of a nuclear submarine. It's all in the detail with Mr. Pope, isn't it?
Really is.
He gives and he gives.
Lovely Mark Knight. Long time no see, President G. We have a lot of catching up to do as he's juggling all the various things here.
Yes.
And the kicker's got me old China plate.
Yeah, very nice.
This beautiful Matt Golding, the Bubble Elbow Bill, as the president here is pulling diplomatic deep freeze ice creams out. We've got the Calippo ScoMo.
Ah, yes, the drums of war stick.
Yep.
Payne's Frosty Fruits.
I thought a Golden Gaton would be better, surely. Or a Frosty Fruit.
And Burmo's Icy Pole.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very nice. But Bob Balbo Bill, that is a really
Bob Balbo Bill.
That's quite a mouthful.
Yes. Meanwhile, in the US, Cathy, Trump's presidential campaign might be hotting up, but the response has been a lot cooler than he'd expected, I think.
I've got to say, it's kind of like the best of all worlds for cartoonists, because there's a slight re-emergence of Trump, but not in a way that he may actually go on, it's good also to know that he might not make it through this time. So we can just play around with him again.
David Rowe here is channeling The Shining, I think, and Jack Nicholson. Here's Danny. The grand old party elephant here with I think, defending themselves with a DeSantis knife.
Aha.
No.
You think that's a knife? This is an axe.
I did love this Golding. Make him go away. Murga.
I would like that hat.
I would like that hat too.
We could all like that hat.
Please enough.
Yeah.
Kathy, Glenn Lelevre has just a beautiful cartoon. What happens in Bali stays in Bali. And how much can this elbow bear? Finally, Kathy, congratulations to Mark Knight, who took out the Walkley for this year with his ScoMo's ministry swearing in of all ScoMos.
Indeed, that's a great cartoon, and congratulations to Mark Knight for that.
It was probably the cartooning moment of the year, would you say? The multiple ministries?
I think so. It was the point where reality surpassed satire, don't you think?
Yeah. Kathy, it's been a great pleasure, El Presidente, unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Thank you, Mike, and it's back to you, David.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Stan, to you first.
I want to just go back to the Trump thing, that an odious character who's been a sexual predator, a racist, under investigation, can still seriously be thinking about nomination and potentially winning, does go to the problem that we see in our world. It's not the rise of China that will overthrow the global order. It'll be the wreckage within the West, the inequality, the division, the political populism. Where is the ballast to authoritarianism if the great shining light of democracy, you come down to a choice of Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
Annika.
This Victorian election, a lot of people are saying, are boring because Labor are in front of the polls. I disagree. I think it'll be a real test of what the independents will do, whether the federal election was an anomaly or whether there is a genuine dislike for the major parties, and not just the Teals. There are Teals running in those inner city seats. There are also independents in the west of Melbourne. And importantly, country independents are really on the rise in Victoria. So I think that will give us a real sort of litmus test of whether this independence movement is here to stay and whether it's beyond just those Teal seats.
Yeah, it's a really good point, one to watch on the night. Greg.
So, David, I'd take you back to China. So China's strategic policy is still absolutely antithetical to Australia, and they still take a whole swag of anti-Australian actions. We mustn't let either some folks in the business community or that brace of pro-China commentators that we have now define the success of the relationship by the continued favour the Albanese government gets from China. It's great, everything that's happened, but we've got to maintain our maturity and self-confidence and independence in face of all that.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. Great discussion. Now, don't forget to check out the Insiders Back to You podcast. Joe Laverty and Greg Jennett joined me this week to answer your questions. Thanks for sending them in. You can see how to do so there on screen. We'll be back with a new podcast episode on Friday. Finally, I think we can call this one Fancy Folder Envy. Anthony Albanese got to know his new British counterpart, Rishi Sunak, this week, but he was particularly taken with the famous folder carried by occupants of number 10 Downing Street. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
You know, I put it there deliberately just to rub it in. Just exactly that. Yeah.
The Prime Minister of the UK has a very good book.
You didn't bring your kind of invitation.
I have a little $1.50 folder.
We're going to get you one of these. That's the commitment.
That's part of the free trade agreement.
We'll chuck in one of these.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.